Every weekend, millions of people pull plants out of their yards, bag them up, and haul them to the curb. And I understand the impulse. A clean lawn is satisfying. But here's what most people don't know they're throwing away. One of the plants on today's list contains more of a particular omega-3 fat than any leafy green ever tested in a laboratory. It grows in sidewalk cracks and gravel, in the worst soil you've got. Another one was listed in the official United States Pharmacopoeia, the government's own reference list of recognized medicines, for close to 50 years, specifically for hemorrhage. A third one shows up in a randomized, double-blind clinical trial for allergy symptoms. A fourth was found as pollen in a Neanderthal burial site 60,000 years ago. These plants have been in documented, continuous use across every continent since before recorded history, and most people are mowing them down on Saturday mornings without a second thought. 11 of them today. What they actually are, what the research says, and what to do with them. One thing before we start. Nothing in this video replaces your doctor or your prescriptions. If you're on medication or managing a health condition, bring any of this to your physician first. Let's start with the one you've almost certainly already got. Dandelion, Taraxacum officinale. If you want the full name, your doctor's not going to ask for. Every part of this plant is edible. The root, the leaf, the flower. Folks spend good money on weed killer for this one, every single spring, without fail. You'll know it by the rosette of jagged leaves lying flat to the ground, and a single yellow flower sitting atop a smooth, hollow stem. No branching, no side shoots. That hollow stem is a good way to tell it apart from lookalikes like cat's ear, which has a solid, hairier stalk. Small detail, matters when you're foraging. I roast the root some autumns. Slice it thin, dry it low, and slow in the oven. Grind it up. Tastes something like coffee, if coffee had a little more bite to it, and a little less caffeine to keep you up at night. Herbalists have used dandelion root for generations as what's called a bitter in taste, on purpose. And here's the kitchen table version of why that matters. Your digestive system responds to bitterness a bit like your ears respond to an alarm clock. It wakes things up. Traditionally, bitters were taken before meals to get digestive juices moving, the same way you'd rev an engine before pulling out of the driveway on a cold morning. The French have an old nickname for it, pissenlit, which translates about as bluntly as you'd guess, on account of its traditional reputation as a mild diuretic. Folk names like that tend to stick around for a reason. They're a kind of oral record, passed down long before anyone wrote a study. Modern research on dandelion is still catching up to the folklore, and I'll say that honestly rather than oversell it to you. Preliminary studies suggest dandelion may support liver function and mild fluid balance, and the leaf is genuinely rich in potassium, vitamin A, and vitamin K. But preliminary is the honest word here. This isn't settled science with a decade of large trials behind it. It's tradition, backed by early, promising research, and that's a meaningfully different thing than proof. I'll tell you something my grandmother used to say, or, well, I think it was her. It might have been her sister. Honestly, the two of them ran together in my memory so much they might as well be one woman. One of them used to say, "A weed is just a plant nobody's figured out yet." I think about that every time I'm out in the garden, kneeling in the same dirt she once knelt in. If you've got gallstones, a bile duct obstruction, or you're already on diuretics or blood pressure medication, dandelion root is one to run past your doctor first. It can interact with those, more than people expect from something growing in a crack in the driveway. Simple as that, and worth the 5-minute phone call. Every single yellow flower you've ever mowed down without a second thought. That's dandelion, and it's just the first name on our list today. Plantain, not the banana relative, a different plant entirely, and one you've absolutely stepped on. Broad, ribbed leaves, low to the ground, growing in the cracks of every sidewalk and the compacted dirt of every well-worn path. There's also a narrower-leafed cousin, ribwort plantain, with the same properties, if you find that one instead. Native peoples of this continent had a name for it too. Once European settlers arrived, they called it white man's footprint, because it seemed to spring up everywhere those settlers walked. Not a compliment exactly, but an accurate observation about how far and how fast this plant travels. Look for the parallel veins, 5 to 7 of them, running the full length of each leaf. staying visible even when the leaf gets crushed flat underfoot on a well-worn path. That vein pattern is the surest way to tell true plantain apart from other broadleaf weeds growing nearby. The old Anglo-Saxon healers called it one of their 9 sacred herbs. They called it way bread because it grew everywhere people walked, and it shows up in a healing charm recorded in a manuscript nearly 1,000 years old. Records from that era describe it crushed and applied to bites, stings, and minor wounds. That's roughly 1,000 years of the same use, written down, generation after generation. Here's the plain English version of why it might have worked. Plantain leaves are what herbalists call mucilaginous, meaning crush them, and they release a slippery, gel-like substance. Think of it like the plant's own bandage. That gel sits over irritated skin the way a damp cloth sits over a scrape, protecting it while the body does its own work underneath. Plantain also contains a compound called allantoin, which researchers have documented as encouraging skin cell turnover, which is really just a fancier way of saying it may help the surface of a minor scrape knit itself back together a touch faster. Traditionally used. Not clinically proven the way a prescription ointment is proven. I want to be honest with you about that distinction every single time it applies, not just when it's convenient. Rain or shine, this one's out there. Stubborn. I've watched it survive foot traffic, lawnmowers, drought, being pulled clean out of the ground, and come right back the next season, like it's got somewhere important to be. This isn't a substitute for cleaning and properly treating a real wound, and for anything deep, dirty, or slow to heal, that's a doctor's job, not a backyard one. But for the everyday nicks and bug bites, folks have been reaching for this leaf a long, long time, and there's a real plausible reason why. My grandkids know this one better than they know half the vegetables in my garden, honestly. First thing I reach for after a bee sting, or a scraped knee out here, crushed fresh, right on the spot. No trip to the medicine cabinet required. Shakespeare even worked it into Romeo and Juliet. A character recommends plantain leaf for a broken shin, tossed off as such common knowledge it needed no explaining to the audience. That's how ordinary this plant was to everyday first aid 400 years back. Here's the one I promised you. Purslane. Small, reddish stems, thick little paddle-shaped leaves, tiny yellow flowers that only open in full sun. It grows low, fast, and it grows in the worst soil you've got. Driveway cracks, gravel, neglected corners nothing else will touch. Researchers going back to a study in the early 1990s and confirmed again in later work tested the fatty acid content of purslane leaves against common leafy greens, spinach among them. Purslane came out on top by a wide margin. Higher levels of a particular plant-based omega-3 called alpha-linolenic acid than any other leafy vegetable measured in that research. Here's the kitchen table version. Omega-3 fats are a bit like oil in a hinge. Your cells have membranes, outer walls, essentially, and the type of fat in your diet affects how flexible and well-oiled those walls stay over time. Fish is the source most people know about. Purslane is the one growing, uninvited, in the cracks of your own patio. This isn't some obscure discovery either. Purslane's been eaten across the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Mexico for centuries. You'll find it in Greek salads, in Turkish yogurt dishes, and in Mexican verdolagas, usually cooked down with pork or in a simple tomato sauce. The rest of the world's kitchens figured this one out long before American lawns declared war on it. Crunchy, slightly lemony, that's purslane raw, straight off the stem. I toss a handful into salads all summer, same as you might toss in cucumber, and it holds its texture better than you'd expect from something this delicate looking. It's also got a fair bit of oxalate in it, same family of compound found in spinach and rhubarb. So if you've got a history of kidney stones, that's worth a conversation with your doctor before you make it a daily habit rather than an occasional one. Moderation, same as you'd practice with spinach. One safety note worth real attention here. Purslane has a mildly toxic look-alike called spurge, which grows in similar spots but has a thinner, non-succulent leaf and a telltale milky sap when you snap the stem. Purslane's sap runs clear, every time. If you ever see milky sap, that's not purslane. Leave it right where it is. It reseeds itself with a stubbornness that would be impressive in any other plant. Pull it up today, and you'll likely find new seedlings in that exact same spot within the week. especially once the summer heat really sets in. It earned its place on this list with real laboratory data, not folklore alone, and that's more than most of what's sitting in the supplement aisle can say. Stinging nettle, and yes, it earns the name. Brush against the leaves barehanded, and you'll feel it within seconds. Tiny hollow hairs on the stem and leaf underside break off on contact and inject a mix of compounds, including histamine and serotonin, that trigger an immediate inflammatory response. Gloves, always. When you're harvesting this one, no exceptions. There's a look-alike worth mentioning, dead nettle, which has a similar leaf shape but no sting at all, and none of the same documented history. If you're not sure which you found, treat it as the stinging kind until you're certain. Better cautious than sorry, especially with children or pets nearby. Cook it, dry it, steep it. The sting disappears completely once heat gets involved. Heat breaks the compounds down entirely. I steam mine like spinach. When the young leaves are still tender and the plant hasn't gone to seed yet, that's the window to catch it at its best. Harvest the top few inches of new growth. Snip with scissors, rather than pulling by hand, straight into a bag, gloves the whole time. Once it's blanched in boiling water for even 30 seconds, you can handle it barehanded with no trouble at all. Nettle soup shows up independently in Irish, Scottish, and Eastern European cooking traditions, usually built around the same simple idea, a way to use the free, nutrient-dense greens coming up right when root cellars were running low after a long winter. Practical food, long before it was ever a wellness trend. Nettle's been used as a tonic across a dozen different traditions, largely for its iron content, and it earns that reputation honestly. It's genuinely rich in it, along with calcium and vitamin K. Folks used to say a few weeks of nettle tea would build the blood back up after a long winter of heavier, less varied eating. There's also a specific clinical trial worth mentioning, honestly, because it's one of the few plants on this list with an actual placebo-controlled study behind it. Back in 1990, researchers tested freeze-dried nettle leaf against a placebo for seasonal allergy symptoms, published in the journal Planta Medica. The results were modest. Participants rated it somewhat more helpful than placebo on an overall assessment, though daily symptom diaries showed less of a clear difference between the two groups. Mixed evidence. I'd rather tell you that plainly than promise you it's a cure for hay fever, because honestly, it isn't. Here's my honest take. Watching this plant most of my adult life, it won't replace your allergy medication, and I'd never suggest that to you. But as a nutrient-dense green with a real, if modest, research trail behind it, worth growing, worth respecting those gloves too, every single time. Persistent, that's the word for nettle. Cut it back, and it's up again within the month, patch a little wider than before, spreading right along the fence line whether you asked it to or not. Chickweed, delicate little thing, easy to miss if you're not looking down. Tiny white star-shaped flowers, thin trailing stems, and it carpets the ground in the cooler months when almost nothing else in the garden is growing at all. One little trick for identifying it correctly, look closely at the stem, and you'll find a single thin line of fine hairs running down one side only, switching sides at each leaf joint. It's a small detail, but it's the detail old foragers relied on before anyone had a field guide with photographs. It's in the pink family, botanically, cousin to carnations more than to anything you'd expect from something growing flat against the dirt. That relation shows a little in the tiny white flowers, if you look closely. 5 petals, each split so deep it looks like 10 at a glance. It's mild, almost bland, honestly, a little like corn silk in texture. That mildness is part of why it's been used topically for centuries. Folks applied crushed chickweed to irritated or itchy skin, the way you might reach for a cool washcloth instead of scratching at something that's bothering you. It carries a modest amount of vitamin C and some mild saponin compounds, plant-based compounds that traditional herbalists associated with a gentle, soothing effect on skin and mild diuretic action. I'll say it again, because it matters. Traditional association, not a settled clinical finding backed by large trials. Rare, actually, to find a plant this unassuming with this much folk history behind it. Herbal texts going back centuries mention it for soothing salves and simple salads both, right alongside the more famous herbs of the same era. I keep a patch going in a shaded corner year-round. mostly for the birds, if I'm honest with you. Chickens and songbirds alike seem to love it, which is very likely where the common name came from in the first place. Cool. That's the word people reach for, describing how it feels applied fresh, cool, and a little damp, like the underside of a leaf after rain. I'll be honest with you, chickweed is one of the gentler entries on this list. No dramatic mechanism, no headline-grabbing compound, just a plant with a long, consistent record that most people walk right over every single day. Cleavers, or sticky willy, if you grew up calling it that. The name comes from those tiny hooked hairs that let it cling to your clothes, your dog, your gloves, just about anything that brushes past it on a walk. It grows in tangled, scrambling mats along fences and hedgerows earlier in the year than most of what's around it. Whorls of narrow leaves circle the square stem in neat little rings, 6 to 8 per set, which is a handy way to be sure of what you've found. Cleavers is actually in the same plant family as coffee, believe it or not, the madder family. Some old foragers used to roast the small round seeds as a coffee substitute in a pinch, similar in spirit to what we talked about with dandelion root earlier in this video. Traditional herbalists have used cleavers for generations as what's called a lymphatic tonic. Here's the plain version. Your lymphatic system is a bit like the drainage ditches alongside a country road. Quiet, easy to forget about, but doing real work moving fluid and waste out of your tissues day and night. Cleavers has long been associated with supporting that drainage, traditionally taken as a mild, cold-infused tea. I want to be straightforward with you on this one, more than most. The lymphatic support claim is largely traditional. It hasn't been tested in the kind of large clinical trials that would let me say proven with a straight face, and mean it. Evidence based on recorded traditional use across a fair number of separate herbal traditions independently. That's the honest label for it. It's mild enough that folks used to make a simple infused water with it, cold steeped overnight in a jar on the counter, and sip through the morning, the way you might sip on infused cucumber water at a garden brunch. It's an old ritual in more than one European tradition, a cleaver's tonic, taken while the plant is fresh and young, meant to clear out the sluggishness of winter. Whether or not the mechanism holds up to modern scrutiny, there's something to be said for a ritual that gets you outside foraging. It does thin out on its own once the weather turns warm and dry. That's part of why it's so tightly tied to early season use in the old traditions. Catch it while it's young and fresh, before it's gone brittle in the heat. Simple, persistent, easy to overlook until it's climbed halfway up your fence post, quietly, while you weren't looking. Yellow dock. You'll know it by the leaves, long, with a distinctive wavy, curled edge, and by late summer, tall rust-colored seed stalks that stay standing well into winter, long after everything around them has gone brown and flat. The root is the part with the history behind it. Dug up, sliced, dried, traditionally paired with nettle in old blood-building tonics, largely on account of its iron content, and its long-standing use in traditional Western herbalism as a mild digestive bitter, similar in spirit to dandelion root. Here's a garden aside for you. My old fence line is absolutely lined with this stuff, and for years I just yanked it and tossed it straight in the yard waste bin without a second thought. Took me embarrassingly long to look closer at what I was throwing away every single autumn. The seeds have their own small history, too. Dried and ground, they make a coarse flour with a flavor somewhere between buckwheat and bitter. Docks are actually in the buckwheat family, which is why. People have used them in breads and porridges for centuries, and modern foragers still do. You'll sometimes hear yellow dock and its close cousin, curly dock, used interchangeably in older texts, and traditionally they were, same genus, similar enough properties and similar enough looks that most old herbals didn't bother distinguishing between the two with much precision at all. The iron pairing with nettle isn't accidental, by the way. Old herbalists noticed that iron-rich plants seem to work better together than alone, long before anyone understood absorption at a biochemical level. They just watched what helped people feel less tired and wrote it down for the next generation. Yellow dock does contain naturally occurring compounds called anthraquinones, the same broad family found in a few other traditional digestive herbs. In larger amounts, these have a mild laxative effect, which is precisely why moderation matters here. and why anyone with digestive conditions, or who's pregnant or nursing, should check with their doctor before using it regularly rather than treat it casually like a garnish. Rust-colored and stubborn as anything, some plants earn their reputation for being hard to remove, and this is one of them, which frankly is part of why it's stuck around this long in folk medicine to begin with. Persistence tends to get noticed, one way or another. Red clover, the one with the round, dusty pink blossom heads growing low in lawns and pastures alike, and easily confused with the smaller white clover unless you look closely at the color and the size of the bloom. Bees love it. I let a patch of my backfield go to clover most summers, just for that reason alone. Farmers have grown red clover for centuries for an entirely different reason than we're discussing today. It fixes nitrogen in the soil, enriching the ground for whatever gets planted after it. The plant was feeding the earth itself long before anyone thought to study what it might do for the human body. This one's had genuine scientific attention, more than most on this list, because red clover contains compounds called isoflavones, plant compounds that share a loose structural resemblance to human estrogen. That resemblance is exactly what led researchers to study it specifically for menopausal symptoms, starting several decades back. And here's where I have to be careful with you, because this is the plant on today's list where the research is genuinely mixed, more so than any other. Some clinical trials have found modest improvement in hot flash frequency compared to placebo. Others have found no meaningful difference at all between the two groups. Researchers are still working out why the results vary so much from study to study. Differences in dose, preparation method, and who was actually studied likely all play a part in that inconsistency. This is exactly the kind of plant where I need you to talk with your doctor before using it with any regularity, especially if you're on blood thinners, take hormone therapy, or have a history of a hormone-sensitive condition like certain breast or uterine cancers. Those isoflavones can genuinely interact with treatment. This isn't a maybe check with someone if you feel like it. This is a please actually make that call before you start. You'll find it dried and sold as tea in most health food stores now, usually blended in with other herbs rather than sold on its own, which honestly makes the dosing harder to pin down precisely if you're trying to match what a particular study actually used. I'll tell you plain, I'm not going to promise you clover will fix hot flashes, because the honest research won't let me promise that in good conscience. What I can tell you is that it's one of the more thoroughly studied plants in your own backyard, and that, on its own, earns it a place here today. Mullein, tall, with soft, almost felt-like gray-green leaves that hug the ground in the first year, before it sends up a flowering stalk the second year that can reach 6 feet or better, straight up out of the middle of that low rosette. Soft, genuinely soft, like flannel. Folks used to call it cowboy toilet paper, which tells you plenty about the texture and nothing at all about its actual older reputation as an herb. Mullein leaf and flower have a long traditional history as a respiratory herb, used across both European and Native American traditions as a tea for coughs and general chest irritation. Think of the leaf like a soft flannel blanket for an irritated airway. That's the plain-spoken version of what generations of herbalists were reaching for when they picked it. One practical note, and it matters quite a bit. Those fine little hairs on the leaf can irritate your throat if you brew a tea straight, unstrained. Always strain mullein tea through a fine cloth before drinking it. I learned that one the hard way, coughing straight through my own cup the first time I tried it. Some years back now. There's an older historical note worth including, honestly, even though I wouldn't recommend it myself. Dried mullein leaf was traditionally smoked in some folk traditions for chest complaints, a practice with essentially no modern safety research behind it. I'd stick to the tea, well-strained, and leave that particular tradition in the history books where it belongs. The flowers have their own separate tradition too, infused slowly in oil for ear discomfort, a genuinely old folk remedy, though again, one without the kind of modern clinical backing that would let me recommend it over whatever your doctor would suggest for the same complaint. The plant's got a long biennial habit worth knowing, too. That soft rosette the first year is just gathering strength underground, and the flowering stalk only comes the second summer. Tall spikes of small yellow flowers opening a handful at a time, working their way up the stem over several weeks. Preliminary research on mullein's traditional respiratory use is still limited, and largely made up of older, smaller studies promising folklore, thin modern data behind it so far. I want you to know exactly where the evidence actually stands today, not where I'd personally like it to stand. Tall, unmistakable, once you know it, and every single stalk I've got started from one plant I almost pulled years back before I looked closer and decided to let it be. Yarrow, feathery, fern-like leaves, flat clusters of small white flowers, sometimes a soft pink, standing about knee-high through most of the summer, in meadows, roadsides, and the drier corners of most gardens. This is the one I mentioned at the very start. Archaeologists have documented yarrow pollen in a Neanderthal burial site over 60,000 years old, which makes it one of the oldest documented medicinal plants in the entire human record. Its scientific name, Achillea, comes straight from Greek legend. Achilles reportedly carried it to treat his soldiers' wounds during the Trojan War. Taught to him, the story goes, by the centaur Chiron. Folk names across English-speaking regions include soldier's woundwort and nosebleed plant, which tells you plainly what it was for. Here's what's genuinely documented, not just legend. Yarrow contains a compound called achillene, which researchers have recorded as constricting small blood vessels and speeding clotting time. It was actually listed in the official United States Pharmacopoeia, the government's own reference list of recognized medicines at the time, from 1836 all the way through 1882, specifically for hemorrhage and fever. Nearly 50 years of formal recognition. For a plant, most of us step right over. Potent. That's not an exaggeration for this one. It's the documented reason it earned a formal listing in official medical references for close to half a century, back when the pharmacopoeia meant something quite different than it does today. There's also a compound called chamazulene, released when yarrow flowers are steam distilled, which gives true yarrow essential oil that distinctive deep blue color, and which researchers have documented as having anti-inflammatory properties in laboratory studies. Beautiful thing to see, honestly. That first time, a plant with plain white flowers producing an oil that particular shade of blue. Yarrow's leaves are edible too, in small amounts, with a sharp, almost peppery bite to them. Not something I use often in the kitchen myself, but worth knowing if you're identifying the plant by taste as well as by sight. I keep dried yarrow in my own first aid kit, right alongside the bandages, for minor cuts and scrapes. But I want to be clear about the boundary here. This is for small, superficial nicks only. Anything deep, anything that won't stop bleeding on its own with basic pressure, anything from a serious injury, that's an emergency room, not a garden bed. And if you're on blood-thinning medication, talk with your doctor before using yarrow regularly, since its clotting action can interact with those prescriptions in ways worth understanding first. Nature's provided this one a long time before any of us showed up to garden over it. I try to remember that, pulling it out of places I don't want it, and leaving it be in the corners where I do. Violet, last one on today's list, and maybe the prettiest of the bunch. Small purple flowers, heart-shaped leaves, carpeting shady lawn corners in the cooler months before most folks have even started mowing for the season. It's been treasured for a genuinely long time, well beyond just its looks. Old European herbals mention violet leaf and flower for soothing coughs and mild skin complaints, and it shows up again independently in early American folk medicine, brought over and then adapted with local plants. Both the leaves and flowers are edible, and the vitamin C content of the leaves has surprised researchers, roughly 130 milligrams per 100 grams, which is more than twice what you'd find in an orange by weight. For something most people spray out of the lawn without a second look, that's a number worth sitting with. Traditional herbalists have long used violet leaf for its mucilage content, similar in principle to plantain, soothing to irritated tissue, traditionally used in teas and syrups for coughs and mild throat irritation. Evidence here is largely historical rather than clinical, and I'll say that plainly rather than dress it up into something it isn't. There's an old belief attached to this one too, more charming than clinical, that violet syrup made a gentle remedy for children's coughs specifically, mild enough for even the youngest in the house, a reputation that likely comes as much from its pleasant taste as from any documented mechanism behind it. You'll find dozens of violet species scattered across North America, most sharing these same rough properties, which makes this one of the more forgiving plants on today's list if you're not entirely certain which exact variety you found growing in your own yard. Was it my mother or my grandmother who first showed me candied violets? Goodness, I genuinely can't recall anymore, but I remember the kitchen, and I remember thinking it was the prettiest thing I'd ever seen come out of a garden bed, dusted in sugar and set to dry on wax paper. I've got a whole shaded bed gone entirely to violet along the north side of the house, more by neglect than by any real design, if I'm being completely honest with you about it. Simple, small, easy to walk right past without a second glance, and that's precisely the theme running through every plant we've covered today, one after another. God-given, every one of these, growing back, season after season, whether we tend them or not, whether we thank them or not, patient in a way most of us could stand to learn from. Now, 11 plants. Every one of them growing somewhere close to where you're sitting right now, whether you've got a quarter acre or a single window box on a fire escape. Dandelion, plantain, purslane, nettle, chickweed, cleavers, yellow dock, red clover, mullein, yarrow, violet. Most of them earned weed status simply for having the nerve to grow somewhere nobody planted them on purpose. I'll say the same thing I said at the start, because it bears repeating twice. None of this replaces your doctor, your pharmacist, or the treatment plan you're already following. What it does is give you a reason to look twice before you reach for the weed killer next time you're out there. I've spent 20 years watching what happens when people wait too long to pay attention to their own health. I'd rather you start paying attention a season early, out here in the dirt, than a season late, somewhere else entirely. Every one of these plants was here doing its work long before there was a pharmacy on every corner, long before any of us had a prescription plan to lean on. That doesn't mean we throw out modern medicine, far from it, not even close. It means we stop overlooking what's been quietly available the whole time, right alongside it. If this one was useful to you, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. I've got a whole garden's worth of these still to cover, and we're only just getting started. And here's my garden fence question for you today. Of these 11, which one is already growing somewhere on your own property? And did you know what it was before today? Tell me down in the comments. I read every single one. Stay blessed, and I'll see you in the next bed over.